there has now been a threat by President Trump today on Twitter to Iran, in which he says, Iran, if you threaten the US again, it will be the end of Iran. I'm desperate about this situation. I have the impression that we're falling for it again. It's like they do it every 10 years. They've done it for Iraq. They've done it for our interventions in South America. It's been going on for 60 years that America gets brought into these wars, and we thought we had a non-interventionist president, and we probably don't.
The ringing of the bell for war against Iran is something that's been going on since I was a teenager. I mean, I came of age in the George W. Bush administration, and you've heard about these things forever. I mean, there's always slanted news pieces against Iran. There's all this stuff about how they're the number one state sponsor of terror, which I, for one, disagree with. I think we should probably look at just exactly what Israel and Saudi Arabia are doing in this regard. But it's obvious nonsense. This is strictly, I would say, Zionist influence on American foreign policy. But I will say, and I'm not going to like come out and guarantee that this will happen. But I do think that a war with Iran won't happen. I do think that it will be averted, and it's for a variety of reasons. But I don't see it happening.
You don't see it happening? Why? Because what I see is all the components that we've seen from past wars. The Zionist influence on media that starts in the media warmongers. Benjamin Netanyahu is pressuring for that kind of war. He's been for more than 10 years, more than as far as I can remember. I mean, since I was young. And we have a president who seems to be bending to these interests. We've seen it in the case of Syria. So how would that roll differently? Would it be essentially in the mind of Trump that the stop would come?
I think, well, I sent you an article before we went live about how Netanyahu, who is a real character, was basically saying, hey, listen, man, we don't want anything to do with this war with Iran. You know, this is getting a little crazy. You know, this rhetoric's getting a little intense. And it kind of made me laugh.
That is the most bullshit I've ever seen in a single article. I mean, he's saying, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly doesn't want to get dragged into the escalating conflict between the US and Iran. And then he says that he will just watch from the sidelines and he will try to get involved the least possible. Dude, this guy has been talking about war with Iran for more than a decade.
Yeah, and what's funny, Benjamin Netanyahu is the kind of guy that gets you into a fight at a bar and then runs out and gets in a taxi and gets home while you're getting arrested. Yeah, it's crazy for him to even say this. But I do think that this is attached to a couple more talking points that kind of make me think we won't have war with Iran. Again, I could be wrong. But I think the failure of the American coup in Venezuela, or at least their second or third attempt, shows that there is a newfound limitation to American power. And it wasn't just that the coup failed. It was that it was, I think, more unpopular than similar military or intelligence community intervention would have been in the 80s or the 90s. And it's kind of ironic when you think about the groups that have pushed demographic displacement on us in our societies. As demographics change, these same groups are less likely to get the wars that they want. You know, so you're seeing this similar rise of like this POC coalition, Ilhan Omar, Representative Tlaib, or whatever the hell her name is, that are weirdly anti-war in the Middle East because they don't see how their racial and ethnic groups benefit from this. They're not victims of the same World War II Holocaust narrative. They don't have this boomer conservative allegiance to Israel. So I think there is a rising domestic unpopularity amongst American citizens against wars for Israel. That's ironically due to immigration. And I also think that Netanyahu, seeing the failure of American power in Venezuela, something that I think probably wouldn't have happened 20 years ago, is maybe making him pull back the reins and say, hey, maybe we don't want to have anything to do with this. Maybe this is going to be a bit of a problem. Now, do I think Netanyahu would be okay with the war still? Of course he would. He's just trying to save face. Could it still happen? Yeah, I'm sure if John Bolton had his way tomorrow, we'd be nuking Iran. But I do think that there's enough to pull the reins on this, particularly, again, with the election coming up and a lot of Trump's base voting for him because he was anti-war.
Very interesting theory, because that would mean essentially, because why is it less popular? Why is the Venezuela coup not working? There's many explanations. As you mentioned, there's immigration. We're getting these leftist populations that are relatively unwilling. First, they identify less with America to start with, so they have less of this patriotic drive of let's go fight for liberty in Vietnam or something. And they are more leftist. The far left is also sympathetic to Muslims in general. But there's also the rise of a nuclei of internet personalities that are totally uncontrolled by the big corporations that used to control CNN, Fox, and that still control them. I think that ultimately, because there's so many people watching the Young Turks, watching Jimmy Dore, watching Kyle Kulinski, of course they are leftists, they are not people I agree with, but at least we agree on non-intervention, and the mass of this may be what made the balance move toward pacifism in the Venezuela case. So if your theory is correct, that would mean we are on our way to have a popular pressure against American interventions that will change the world.
Yeah, I think there's a weird type of polar alliance on the foreign intervention scene here that is very unique. You have whites who voted for Trump that largely voted for him because they were suffering, be it through demographic displacement, be it through actually being the ones who largely go and fight and die in these wars, or if you're in the middle class, you're certainly overtaxed, you're paying for these wars. And then you have the POC coalition that is obviously, if we look at demographics, is on the rise in the Democratic Party. These are people who don't identify with American foreign policy. And these are also people that probably more strongly identify with the third world. And even though they live in America and have an American passport, from a very visceral blood and soil sense of identity, they probably identify more closely with Venezuela than they do with the United States. And so they see white victimization in Venezuela, which ironically is kind of true. It's kind of the paradox that we're in here. And as such, they don't support it. So you have these two groups that, even though they have separate political interests, probably don't support war.
Absolutely. Frank Carr says, it is absolutely unfair to say, why didn't you do this before? It takes time to make legal arguments. There are reasons to try to moderate IDs first. Do you know what he's referring to? Did we say that? Why didn't you do this before? I don't remember. We said it.
I think he's talking about the use of the Insurrection Act and everything else. I mean, again, I've heard that argument. I'm not saying that this gentleman is incorrect. First of all, but I'm glad you're supporting JF with your super chat. But I would say anyone with a realistic sense of what actually makes a country successful or coherent knows that the United States, the American people should have long ago smashed the glass and hit the red button as a state of emergency. So, I mean, even Trump getting elected in and of itself was a desperate call for a savior. I would have had no problem with Trump enacting the Insurrection Act and closing the border the second he was elected, because I think ultimately that's more or less what he was elected to do. It just is my opinion.
Absolutely. Umflov says Trump did the same posturing to Rocketman. It's true that this whole threat that he's doing to Iran, he's been doing it to a lot of other countries and even public personalities. I mean, Trump just uses threats on his Twitter. It's not clear in what kind of 6D chess world does that work, but maybe people have argued, for example, that in the North Korea case, it is his aggressive stance combined with an actual willingness to discuss that has pacified the region. So who knows what he's thinking. Nietzschean modernist says a war with Iran would be disastrous for the United States right now. We are so divided it would lead to massive civil unrest. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I think a war with Iran could have even had that same effect in 2003. You know, you're talking about a more unified nation. I'm pretty sure, I mean, not this is too important, but by and large has a higher average IQ, and that has had the fortitude to withstand significant military action against it before. I mean, the Iranians resisted the Iraqis when both the Soviets and the Americans were funding the Iraqis against the Iranians back in the 80s and into the early 90s. These are intelligent people who have a unifying culture, whereas in Iraq is a kind of a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society that was being held together by CIA-installed autocrat by the name of Saddam Hussein. So I think it would have been a disastrous war, even if we weren't spread so thin. At this point, considering the situation, national debt, opioid crisis, illegal immigration, it would be a death knell for the United States to go to war with Iran, no doubt about it.
It's not clear to me how it would turn out. Trump tries to present this as we're essentially going to erase the country Iran from history. It's not going to exist anymore. That's what he says in his threat. It's going to be the end of Iran. It doesn't seem that easy. It seems that if they do like Iraq, we're essentially going to show up there. We're going to find 15 Jeeps. And there's just going to be a bunch of civilians and people hiding in the mountains and potentially posing bombs. It's more like a guerrilla type war rather than just a line of 1,000 people with guns just shooting each other in line and well ordered.
Yeah, I think it would certainly be a long, drawn out bit of guerrilla warfare. I think there's obviously historical precedent for that in the Middle East as a whole. I mean, we've seen that all over these areas that the United States has destabilized. I think immediately you'd see massive destruction by the United States against the official Iranian military, but I don't think these people would give up that easily. And let's keep in mind, Iran has domestic issues like all countries do, but nothing unifies the people domestically like a foreign invasion. And when you have Americans come in there, and the Iranians aren't stupid, be it because they know this inherently or because their government is correctly showing them this propaganda, they understand. They've said this explicitly. The American Zionist empire. They talk about these things all the time.